Liszt's brief career as an operatic composer is rarely taken seriously today. His only completed opera, Dansante, is typically classed as an unsuccessful juvenile work of dubious authorship. All other planned operas of the 1840s and 50s remain the embryos of ambition, and you can see the range there on the screen. This scattergun approach to great literary topics indicates the breadth of Liszt's ambition, but also underscores the extent to which his desire to conjoin literature and music, the premise of symphonic poetry, may first have been kindled within the aesthetic potential of opera. Like Beethoven's aborted opera Macbeth or Mendelssohn's Lorelei, Liszt's endeavors have garnered scholarly interest, primarily for reasons of curiosity and melancholy. Why were they abandoned? What have we lost? The case of Sardanapalo is unique in that it is the only planned opera for which Liszt wrote any significant music. He devotes 111 pages to it at the start of his music book N4. Now, the music and text of N4 have been known to Liszt scholars for over a century, but with the exception of one or two figures, and notably Kenneth Hamilton, they've been largely ignored on account of their seeming illegibility, incompleteness, and the assumed futility of piecing it all together. The first printed comment on Sardanapalo set the tone. In 1911, Mary Lipsius wrote that Liszt's work amounted to little more than a series of sketches. In 1954, Humphrey Searle catalogued the opera, but paid scant attention to the music in Liszt's hand, declaring it extremely fragmentary for the most part. This unpromising verdict has remained largely unquestioned, with the same token fragments appearing in print on a few occasions. Some diplomatic transcriptions were included in Byron James's PhD from 2009, perhaps the most thoroughgoing study to date of the manuscript N4, but in an uninterpreted form, these make little sense, and James concluded as much, declaring Liszt's music is, quote, often riddled with seeming metric inconsistencies and ambiguous harmonic strategies. As a result, Liszt's aborted opera has lived a half-life through footnotes, an item of passing curiosity, mentioned more out of obligation than interest, and assumed to lack artistic coherence. Transcription and interpretation are inherently interwoven activities, of course, and what Stephen Greenblatt once dubbed the dream of the master text remains a cautionary editorial trope. But even with such a caveat lector, there are several good reasons for not taking on an editorial project of this kind. The music is indeed incomplete. This is the last page. You can see it breaks off in the middle of a march. There's only one source, so external comparison and corroboration is simply not possible. Liszt's grasp of Italian was relatively weak, meaning that we have problems of accentuation in the text. We don't know who the librettist was, and it seems neither did Liszt. He went through an intermediary, as we'll see. And there's no separate libretto text. The libretto is only retrievable from the underlay in N4. Nevertheless, if we read Liszt's manuscript N4 consecutively, across the spatial gaps and shorthand, we find that it's not fragmentary at all, but corresponds to what appears to be almost the entirety of the first act of the planned opera, Sardanapalo. So at this point, I'd like to jump straight to the manuscript and listen to two short, relatively legible passages so you can get a sense of what I mean and the kind of challenges that arise in reading the manuscript. The first is a cavatina from the soprano's opening scene. Here, Mira, a slave girl and the king's lover, despairs of her situation. She dreams of her mother's smile and of her homeland from whence she was abducted. With some different harmonic colors, the second passage occurs in a central duet between Mira and the king, Sardanapalo, where the king explains how he trembles with joy and hope even at hearing Mira's voice. But she tells him to stop, calling herself a wretch who forgets herself in his company. It's rare to discover that a 50-minute act from a 19th century opera has effectively been hiding in plain sight. Yet the evidence points to this being the case. The vocal parts are complete and continuous. They contain most of the libretto text as underlay and make sense as a narrative whole. The piano score is also de facto continuous, but deceptively so. Liszt uses various forms of shorthand throughout, and revisions and deletions abound. But as we'll see, there are no gaps in the musical conception as such. This reading would seem to corroborate Liszt's comment, reported by Hans von Bülow in June 1849, that the opera, quote, is well on the way to completion, end quote, or ziemlich vollendet, is the German. Perhaps it was optimistic. It also suggests Peter Rabe was correct in his written assessment of Liszt's Weimar paper, in the archival catalogue from 1910 and 1911, namely that N4 contains a large continuous section of Liszt's opera, Sardanapalo. More than a century on, it seems Rabe's startled exclamation mark remains valid. You can see it. Now, Liszt engaged really in a fashionable topic when Byron published his tragedy, Sardanapalus, in 1821. He gave the topic exponential currency. And in the 19th century, there were 6 settings that I know of, only one of which predates Liszt's own engagement. Now, his engagement is traceable through correspondence, but Liszt's correspondence exists in a motley array of different individual publications. There is no sämtliche Briefe. Here are the letters connected to the project, and the colors here indicate letters that have not previously been taken into account in research on the project. The purple indicates misdated letters. As you can see, this is quite a body of evidence. Based on the newly available correspondence, published and unpublished, and building on Kenneth Hamilton's pioneering work in establishing an initial version of the chronology in 1996, it now seems most likely that events unfolded as follows. This is essentially a story with 2 key characters and 2 turning points. Liszt asked Félicie Maléfi to provide him with a scenario and libretto. Maléfi missed 2 deadlines, and Liszt fired him. That's the first turning point. At that point, he contacts Cristina Belgioioso, and she procures a libretto via an Italian poet living in her orbit, we think, in Paris. Liszt receives the full scenario in Italian, and he then receives the first act versified, but nothing else. A long delay, and Liszt then decides to move on, and he contacts Giovanni Tadolini, you may know as the connected to the Théâtre Italien in the 1830s. And when Liszt tells Cristina that he plans to finish the opera with Tadolini, she gets into action, it seems, and Liszt then receives the full versified libretto. The two previously unknown sources worth mentioning here explain the part of the problem with Malefi. Liszt's secretary, this is a letter in which Liszt complains about Malefi. His secretary, Belloni, had been received in Paris by Malefi, quote, like a dog in a skittle alley, Liszt explains. And Liszt is uncharacteristically sarcastic in this, indicating his sarcasm. He talks about our Shakespeare not being able to come up with the goods, and then saying to hell with Malefi's Sardanapalo. The second unusual source is a so-called Konzeptbuch in Harvard's Houghton Library. This is a collection of draft letters, and it contains quotations from Malefi in letters that Liszt was sending to the French critic Jules Janin. So we can get a sense of what actually happened, even though the letters to Malefi themselves don't survive. In a nutshell, Liszt had paid 1,000 francs in advance for the scenario. This never arrived, so when Liszt fired Malefi, the Frenchman wrote back saying, if you send me 2,000, then I'll send you the full drama. Liszt was rather upset by this, didn't want to be treated like a cash cow, and if God were to offer me my share of paradise in this way, I would certainly refuse. In August 1848, Liszt confirms that Belgioioso had sent him the full versified libretto. He confirms that composition was underway by the 24th of April 1850 and set about securing a publishing contract from Léon Escudier, who he assures on the 4th of February 1851, quote, I expect to have a copy ready by the end of autumn, end quote. Thus, the music for Act 1, which Liszt did compose, was almost certainly notated during this 9-month period, April 1850 to February 1851. Malefi did, in the end, send the scenario, and there it is. As a form, the music in the first act contains what I think we can describe as 4 discrete chunks of musical architecture. The 2 earlier provisional attempts to interpret the manuscript structure, that's Hamilton's and James's, were rooted in the solita forma tradition. You can see Hamilton's on the right there, where he essentially itemizes what forces were being used and on which manuscript pages, and then James's work rationalizes this much more into a solita forma tradition. By necessity, these were rather speculative, produced without an edition and with very little sense of the libretto that would give rise to such forms. From Francesco Vella and David Rosen's work on the libretto, a synoptic overview based on the music and the musical and the rhyming and metrical scheme of the opera might look something like this. As conventional as this appears, it masks a multitude of idiosyncrasies. Firstly, there's reason to suspect that the anonymous librettist was not wholly conversant with Italian forms. The rhyme scheme is far from clear in demarcating a slow movement from a tempo di mezzo, for instance. And certain conventions are ignored or explicitly rejected, such as the use of 7 and 11 syllable lines for recitative, or the narrative motivation for switching from a tempo di mezzo to cabaletta within such forms. Even when the libretto is clear in its Italian forms, Liszt's setting doesn't necessarily follow these. For instance, in the final trio, the librettist begins with 13 lines of blank verse, which he expects to be set as recitative. Then there are 2 5-line stanzas of 8 syllables for each of the 3 main characters, which we might presume would be set as a slow movement. But Liszt treats all of this as kinetic text. So it's difficult to know where Liszt and or his librettist deviate explicitly from convention and where they may be working in ignorance of convention. The result is a highly idiosyncratic stretch of music, and my current thinking is that it would seem unnecessarily Procrustean to read it more rigorously in terms of solita forma, particularly given Liszt's public inclination to eschew old forms. Now, I alluded earlier to certain editorial challenges. Perhaps the largest of these are the apparent gaps in the accompaniment. There are three significant gaps where multiple continuous vocal parts are written over an absent accompaniment. Here's the first one, which can be taken as representative. The most likely explanation for this is that Liszt wrote down only what he needed to remember. The common element for these passages is formulaic accompaniment that begins clearly but then peters out. It seems Liszt felt the patterned idiom made it unnecessarily, explicitly, to write out the full accompaniment. It could be generated by any competent assistant. Instead, he indicates significant movements in the harmonic direction. You can see the bass survives there, and then when it drops out, it comes back, so he knows where he's going. And he leaves the quaver figuration largely unwritten, as a continuation too obvious to belabor, safe in the knowledge that he would write out a clean copy for later orchestration. Now, here's the score as it might be realized editorially. Contemplating such passages, it's worth recalling Liszt's view of how Italian operas were written at La Scala during the late 1830s. Quote, "One might say it is a manufacturing operation," he explains disapprovingly, "where everything is known in advance and nothing is required but the actual time needed to put the notes on paper." End quote. And it's perhaps indicative that even Fétis criticized Verdi's accompaniments as formulaic and cliched in this regard. In other words, it's a trope of criticism. In such a reading, then, there are no actual gaps in Liszt's understanding of what he wanted. This wasn't a Stichvorlage after all, and he simply deemed it unnecessary to write out the pattern. But beyond the issue of gaps, certain passages appear to be de facto illegible. The moment we just reached is a case in point. The pitches are just about discernible here, but the rhythm certainly isn't. Now, the way that we managed to solve this is by internal cross-referencing. So later on, at the end of the march, we see this passage here, and you can see exactly the same pitches with the upper octave added are present there, but here the rhythm is very clearly defined, and as it frames the march and articulates the verses, it seems a reasonable bet that we can rely on this, and so that's how we solve that particular problem. A slightly different problem is in revisions. Here you can see that Liszt notates the music in 3/4, but he has a second thought. Common time, zwei Takte in einen. So two bars are to be conflated into one. And we do have a piano here, so I'm going to just... So the first version would be something like this. But if you do it in 4/4, it's more like this. Now, luckily, we also have the option to cross-reference here internally as well, and this is how we can make a decision to accept the revision and also to clarify exactly what this pattern would be like in 4/4. And you can see here, there it is in F minor when the king sings of the terror of war. Now, there are moments where the music is tonally very ambiguous. Here we can see naturals here written after a moment in D-flat major. And then we start off with 4 bars in F-sharp minor, where all the accidentals are added. But from here on, there are certain problems. The D-flat, does this continue? An A natural there, where was the A-flat? A B natural there, where was the B-flat? The harmonies don't make a lot of sense in this passage. This is the next page. Here you have a major 7th chord, which just doesn't appear right. The point I want to make is that essentially, if you realize that Liszt is thinking in F minor from this point on, then it becomes easy to rationalize the harmonic language. See, we finish at the moment where we have another set of 4 natural signs. So the implication is that he certainly had a key in mind. Now, there are cases where the stylistic argument doesn't provide enough evidence. This is one instance. We have a D major fanfare. This is the first entry of the king. D major fanfare. The king has an arpeggiated D major chord. Then we have this. Now, the key signature is C sharp minor. But is the F sharp still operative? If so, we'd have an augmented, diminished, augmented, diminished. This is certainly possible. There are works, contemporary works of Liszt where this works. But we could also have F natural. So the stylistic argument is insufficient in this case. When we were able to decipher the text, we find that the language is dimmi fanciulla, angelo mio. Usually in Weber and Marschner, the augmented triad is deployed to signify the supernatural. Here, this would be inappropriate. Also, the idea of fanciulla, angelo mio seems better suited to this tertiary key relation rather than the diminished chords. So this is what we opted for. Now, the libretto text, you may have noticed in several of the examples here, appears to be incomplete. Indeed it is. But working with Francesca and David, we've discovered that most points in the underlay most points where underlay's text is lacking signals a repeat of previous text. Very occasionally, Liszt leaves off the final word or sometimes the final syllable of the last word, evidently because he was working on a separate draft of the libretto and didn't feel it necessary to write out all the text. In these cases, we've added the missing word or syllable based, where possible, on the rhyming or metrical schemes. The opening chorus of Concubines offers an example. This is the text. You can see here we have vieni, vieni, risplendono, nothing here. We assume risplendono facci. Nothing here. We assume vieni, vieni, etc. Now, here you can see a question mark. He gets the accent wrong. Oblia is how he sets this. But he knows that it's slightly suspect, and he corrects it. Oblia, oblia nell'estasi, etc. There are cases where he doesn't correct it. Here you can see the false accent, il vigile sguardo. And so the question arises, should we correct this? On the assumption that Liszt would have shown this to Christina, that Belloni himself, Liszt's secretary, was Italian, and that surely some singer at some point would have pointed it out, we assume that Liszt would have not stood for mistakes, amateur mistakes like this. So where it's possible to make rhythmic emendations without any damage to the harmonic structure and the overall rhythmic structure, we've corrected it like this. There are occasions where we can't do that, where the accent is too embedded. You see here, Ninive, as opposed to Ninive. But this is in the chorus, and it's so embedded we can't get around it. Now, Joachim Raff writes to his mother in December 1851, explaining that he had been told to expect a score for the opera for him to orchestrate. This is December 1851. And you can see that Liszt provides certain orchestral cues. Here, viola is at the bottom of a four-part texture, indicating strings in four parts without celli. Horns, we'll hear this in just a moment. Clarinet, this is the very opening, and oboe, these woodwind lines. And here we heard the march theme. Perhaps you saw this earlier. The first and second violins have their accompaniment specified. So, Liszt obviously never got to this stage, but it's possible to use these cues that he did write as a basis for hypothetical orchestration. Now, a short scene was performed last month by the BBC National Orchestra of Wales with soprano Anoush Hovhannisyan, and it offers a sense of what an orchestral rendition would sound like. So in our final example, I'm going to switch between piano score, what Liszt writes in N4, and a hypothetical orchestration. For Liszt, quote, once musical characterization was transplanted from staged tragedy, a declamatory style was necessarily created, end quote. And from his published essays in the Neue Zeitschrift, 1854 to 55, we know that Liszt associated this declamatory style with Meyerbeer's Robert and Rossini's Otello in particular. We see this, his own declamatory melody in the next passage here. Listen here also for the chromatic voice leading, which seems to undermine Hamilton's preliminary conclusion that Liszt's music gives, quote, the effect of a work written by two different composers, end quote, where Liszt's chromatic harmony is reserved for the orchestra, while the voice remains entirely diatonic. On the contrary, it now seems that the voice is integral to the chromatic sequences. You have the libretto on screen. In this example, Mira alone reflects angrily on her situation, racked between her genuine love for a weak and effeminate king and the memory of her conquered homeland and deceased family. So listen out here for the voice leading.
Schiuma silenzio rapimento il suo sguardo m'affidò. D'ineffabile contento il mio cuore si beò. D'ineffabile contento il mio cuore si beò.
Just to conclude now. Producing such an edition involves a certain amount of reverse engineering, not only regarding the accompanimental gaps, but in deciphering the order of revisions, interpreting absent accidentals, and determining text underlay with incomplete evidence. Such work can be carried out only on the assumption that Liszt had a detailed, worked-out conception of the music for Act 1 that he was notating, but that he didn't always write it out fully. Here, the principal challenge for the music is to understand where repetitions occur. In such a view, very little creative input is required, providing the editor can access this conception by deciphering the shorthand. What survives in Sardanapalo, therefore, constitutes a fragment, in Schlegel's sense, of something complete in itself, and yet essentially incomplete, rather than a Bruchstueck as the detached piece, pure and simple, the residue of a broken ensemble. Such a finished condition offers something of an archaeological site for tracing the merger of Liszt's Italianate idiom and developing harmonic praxis. The alacrity with which Liszt sought to set about composing music for Sardanapalo after finally receiving the libretto suggests that he was undaunted by composing operatic music as such, that he was working on an opera in earnest at the same time as composing his first 3 symphonic poems indicates his drive to bridge a literary and musical imagination was strikingly indifferent to its medium. This also suggests that he didn't distinguish between the respective compositional challenges on aesthetic or technical grounds. The critical difference lay in the challenge of accepting another's libretto that digested an original text by Byron or Shakespeare rather than writing or quoting a verbal program about music that itself reflected an original text. The former proved an uncrossable Rubicon for Liszt, whose emotional investment in certain venerated authors made it correspondingly difficult for him to trust their paraphrases. Finally, then, Liszt sought in Sardanapalo an opera that honored Byron's play to an inhibiting degree. The poetic fragment is therefore perhaps the most apt form for an offering born of such unchecked idealism. Thank you.